Wow, this is an incredible turnout. Thank you so much for coming here. Hello. Yes, so I would like to present material that I've selected today from the Irradiant Archive, which is a collection that very few people know about or have worked on, and I've had accidentally stumbled across on my own during my DPhil, and now I'm in kind of postdoctoral phase. But anyway, I want to say just a few quick introductory words about the archives we establish a ground, and then I want to actually show you an example of how I'm working with the material as an artist, artistic researcher, and using also practice-based methodologies. So even though working with archives involves an extensive amount of specialist knowledge, history, sociology, anthropology, literary criticism, and I'm interested in all of those things, I am none of those things in terms of disciplinary expertise. I am an artist, and I do believe there are methods that can come from artistic practice that can also contribute towards knowledge in an academic context. So the Irradiant Archive is named after a manuscript, which is here in the middle. These notebooks are part of this extensive manuscript. It is a story that totals to around 600,000 words, which is a lot. So these are just a few of the notebooks, but there's a lot of loose leaf papers as well. Nudrazi is a Persian word. It means actually missile or projection or flashlight, but the author of this manuscript translated it as irradiant. So he also variates in titling the story. Sometimes he says Nudrazi, sometimes he says irradiant. The author, his name is Ali Mirdrekvandi, and he was a peasant laborer who was born in 1919 or so, roughly speaking, in Lorestan, which is a tribal region of Western Iran. And during World War II, he found work with the British and American occupying forces. So for those who don't know, Iran was invaded or occupied by the Allies during World War II. It was a strategic location for obviously the war effort. And the railroad that went from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea was mobilized basically to ship fuel and weapons and artillery to the Soviet Union. So Ali was working on the railroad before. He was working in Tehran. He was a cafe sweeper, apparently. He found an English language dictionary, which I assume is this example here, Suleiman Haim's 1934 New Persian English Dictionary. And he started to read the dictionary, study it, and apparently taught himself rudimentary English. So he arrives at Camp AMIRABAD, where the British and American soldiers are stationed, and presents himself to a British lieutenant in charge of local labor distribution. His name is John Hemming. So you have a picture of Ali here, a picture of John here. This is kind of material from the camp. Ali presents himself in the form of a letter saying, I have learned 1,000 words of English. I would like a job in which I can practice my English. And a whole weird and strange intimacy develops between the two. They become friends. He ends up working at the camp, becomes a kind of private servant of sorts, various odd jobs, lighting the boiler room fire, collecting wood, like working at the cafeteria. And in nightly sessions, he meets John Hemming, this British lieutenant, and they practice English language together. And Ali begins to write a story in order to practice his language. And the story begins, and it does not stop. So it does not stop. So it's just a flow of words. And in these kind of original notebooks, you will see he has, in the first couple of notebooks, there are these word lists, vocabulary lists, where he also is translating into Persian the new words that he's learning and using. And the story is kind of the form of, let's say, a popular romance or an epic, let's say, in its scope. But it's adventures. It's this young boy named Irradiant who meets different friends and fights various monsters and enemies, and there's evil kings and demons and dragons and all of that. And it just goes on and on and on and on. So the war ends, the Allies leave, but Ali remains in touch with John through a series of letters and correspondences, and sends his story finished years after the war in by post via the British embassy in Ahvaz in southern Iran, and then asks John, publish this for me and send me the money. And unfortunately that never happens, and so there's a whole tragedy in this archive in which John is unable to publish Irradiant because, in his own words, there's not enough paper in the world to publish a proper edition of the story, especially after World War II, where there was genuinely a paper shortage, apparently. But in response to that, Ali writes a short story, a novella, called The British and American Officers Book. And he says, well, if length is the problem, here's a short one, publish this for me. And that actually happens, but it happens too late. Ali ceases his correspondence in a very series of dramatic letters in which he basically addresses himself to the English workers, the noblest, most virtuous, cleverest, wisest workers of the world, giving testimony about his life, about his dilemma and his kind of post-war circumstances back in his village, surrounded and seeing destruction from everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of devastating material in this kind of accepting of his fate, that he's actually not going to get the money that he expected. He writes a series of agreements to God, to the prophets, to the earth, to the river Karun, which runs through the south of Iran, basically dedicating himself to God, waiting to be worthy for speaking in his words. So, he's said too much and now he's going to shut up, basically. So it's a complex tale. The story is eventually published. The short story, The British and American Officers Book, rejigged with a kind of more catchy title, No Heaven for Gungadin. It's extremely autobiographical. It's really a Persian servant and British and American officers lost in the Milky Way looking for heaven. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to show you this notebook. So one of the things that really interests me in this story is how, because this is very personal for me, my father comes from basically the same region as Ali, and I feel like there's a kind of embodiment or a kind of, a witnessing, let's say, of empire's arrival to Iran. And I'm also very interested in the relationship one has in an archive where you have documents, but you're also a body, and there are bodies behind all of this. And so this attempt to draw the material out of the archive and into the world, and to both acknowledge that I am touched by the material, but I also want to touch it. I brought this notebook with me into the Bodleian while I was initially researching. And I mean, I didn't do this inside the Bodleian, but I was filling it up with words just for my reading. And then later on, I went back and intervened in this archive by basically tracing material out from photographs that I had taken and reinterpreting the material itself into a kind of commemoration, or a kind of an act of or a kind of performative restaging of the archival material itself. And I mean, this red thread is, for those who speak German, the rote Faden, like the kind of following the narrative through. And this was a prop ultimately for a performance film in which I staged my encounter with the archive. And one of the things that is very important in this is the presence of soot, both indicating the traces of a hand, but also very much in reference to Ali himself as a laborer, as a peasant, as someone who both describes himself and is described in the materials from the time as extremely dirty. And it's just the way in which, the kind of the material itself, although it's a very, entertaining story, also there's a lot of violence and sadness and heartbreak and failure. And I mean, ultimately it is an imperial collection, and there's ways in which one can think about a kind of micro history of this intimacy as as staging all of the affective resonance of empire arriving to Iran. So you'll probably see different materials here that I've laid out, and they're reflected in my notebook. One of the things that I actually also thought would be interesting to maybe close on, is the notion of rehearsals, which is kind of the red thread in my postdoctoral research. And rehearsals is, of course, in the theatrical sense, a staging, a practicing, a going over, a repeating of the material, but also, I don't know if any of you have heard of the scholar Ariella Aisha Azulai. She's a filmmaker and a decolonial theorist, but she also proposes rehearsals as a mode of working with archival material, which is less about interpreting, but more about repeating and reanimating, in her words, or kind of paraphrasing her words, the words and gestures of those who struggled or resisted against their worlds being destroyed, even and especially if they failed, which is very much the case with Ali's story. So I leave this here, but I want to show you a little magic trick, because the notebook ends on one of the instructions that Ali gave when he was talking about publishing a story was, if it's too long, you can publish it in little bits. And at the end of each volume, write unfinished. And so his story does remain unfinished. And hopefully I've remained somewhat in time. Yeah, fantastic. All right, thank you, everyone.